A common criticism of Marxist theory, whether applied to history or literature or any other cultural artifact, is that it's reductive, that it's stripping reality or the world uh, in a simplistic way, in a way that doesn't do justice to the complexity of the world we live in, of the history we're the heirs of, in a way that doesn't do justice to the richness of human life. Now, Frederick Jameson, whose work Marxism and Form I discussed recently, has an interesting response to this criticism. He notes that any abstraction, any way of understanding reality that relies on an abstracted concept is a reduction. It reduces the complexity of reality down to one specific form or aspect so that we can comprehend it or use it in a particular way. So when we say the apple is red, we are reducing it to its redness, to this abstract colour. We are focusing on one aspect of the apple, comparing it to other objects that have this quality for a particular purpose. When it comes to much bigger and complex issues, such as the nature of history, reality, how we are to interpret culture or artworks, then this issue of reduction, of abstraction, takes on a greater importance, because usually when someone seeks to describe or define what is behind reality or what's ultimately shaping it, they are looking for a sort of totalizing narrative, a totalizing concept that goes beyond just, well, which basket should we put this apple in, but which seeks to explain, to comprehend the object we're trying to understand. And usually this does take the form of a master code, as Jameson would put it elsewhere. As far as artworks, literature goes, there is the liberal humanist view of aesthetics, as it would be called, that focuses on creative genius, categories like beauty, an almost sort of inexplicable quality that, when pressed, can't be fully defined but is almost intuited. This would be perhaps the master code of such a view of literature. And what could be noted, therefore, is that those who complain that Marxist theory reduces things actually make their own reduction. They're always going to reduce history or artworks down to particular master codes, which are no less reductive. And so the real question is not who's being more reductive, but what reduction are we going to make to most satisfactorily comprehend reality, to most satisfactorily comprehend art and literature. And to my mind, there is some truth in that Marxist theory can be simplistic, and this is a criticism that within the world of Marxist theory has been made. For example, someone like Jameson would take issue with what he calls homologies. This is a view of history, a view of cultural history that could be exemplified by someone like Oswald Spengler, whose magnum opus, The Decline of the West, was hugely influential around the World War I era. And for Spengler, he posited that there were different types of civilization, the Magian, the Apollinian, the Faustian, each of which had an almost unique soul. I think he described it as a world soul, that shaped everything from their politics to their artwork, maybe even to their farming methods and other practical things like that. In some sense, all these cultural levels were seen as the same. Um, the disadvantage of this being, of course, that he couldn't explain how a culture could go from one type to another, and also that without a mechanism of cause and effect, he couldn't quite explain how this sameness had taken place, how this spirit had pervaded all aspects of a particular culture, other than asserting it. Now, within Marxist theory, there's an approach which could be criticised in a similar way, particularly in the work of Lucian Goldman, whose book The Hidden God from the 50s is treated with respect by those like Jameson and Terry Eagleton, because it does contain many fascinating and interesting ideas about the world of 17th century France, Blaise Pascal, the Jansenists. It is worth a read. But while Goldman seeks to remedy Spengler's, or something like Spengler's historiography, by introducing the conflict between different classes into his view of history, he can end up making the same moves, the same homologies within those classes. So he would try and define Jansenism, which loosely defined was a movement within Roman Catholicism that was more Calvinistic to a degree, more Augustinian, more focused on God's absolute predestination of who would be saved, who would be damned, and so on. The reaction to which led the Roman Catholic Church to more definitively assert doctrines of free will and so on. But the thing with Goldman's approach is that while he can draw more lines of cause and effect than Spengler could, because he can say, well, this class was reacting against that class and so forth, he's still stuck with the problem that within this class, he describes their various levels of living as the same, that the literary works they produced in some sense were the same as their general class economic status and prospects. And what Jameson and Eagleton would want to point out is that there can be conflicts within a class, that there are class fractions, that there are different individual figures who, by being shaped in different circumstances, might have different dynamics to each other, even while they have certain similarities. And this really picks up on the influence of Louis Althusser, the French Marxist philosopher, whose notion of semi-autonomous spheres of society has been highly influential. So for Althusser, he wanted to avoid this kind of simplistic, vulgar Marxism, as it might be described, by saying, okay, in the final instance, all of cultural life is determined by the base, the economic base, or rather the mode of production of capitalism, of capitalists and wage labourers and so on. But each of the cultural spheres of the state, of the world of art, of religion, has a semi-autonomy. They still have something of their own logic that could conflict with each other, that could move in different ways. There'll be groups within those spheres that conflict with each other and move in different ways. Maybe not in ways that are even economically justified or sensible. And we could think of Donald Trump's attacks on Iran recently as a glaring example of that. But for Althusser, the key thing is that the mode of production always structures all of these different spheres. Ultimately, they are revolving around it and are determined by it, including the economic, which is not precisely the same thing as a mode of production. And that's a very important thing when people start to say, well, Marx just felt it was determination by economic forces. We need to be more precise than that as to what the actual structuring influence is of the actual relations of the mode of production. And to anyone who is critical of Marxist theory, this, of course, could sound like special pleading, like, oh, semi-autonomy. Well, that gives a very handy amount of wriggle room to explain away things that don't seem to be quite justified or quite, economically beneficial to the people who thought or produced certain artifacts and so on. But to someone who is open to historical materialist reading of history and culture, it's a feature rather than a bug. It's something that allows us to try and understand history, to try and understand literature in terms of the forms that we have in front of us, without making assertions about beauty or a national spirit or that kind of thing, which can only be an arbitrary assertion that stops investigation, that forestalls further comprehension. And to me, this is the way that Marxist theory can open up avenues of exploration, and I think proves itself to be no less rich or complex than the claims that more traditional literary theorists would make for their own approaches.